All right, good afternoon. I'm Mona Ateya. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at the George Washington University. We are really delighted to be joined by Dr. Sara Rahnama and Dr. Libby Thompson to talk about Sara's new book, The Future is Feminist, Women and Social Change in Interwar Algeria. It came out just a month and a half ago with Cornell University Press, so we're hot off the press. Sara, feel free to, throw a coupon code into the into the chat box since we are, not in person and we can't sell books. So Dr. Rahnama is assistant professor of history at Morgan State University, author of The Future is Feminist, which examines how commentators saw women's advancement as a key to a prosperous and modern future for Algeria. At Morgan State, she now directs the program for the study of the Middle East and North Africa, which is the first Middle East studies program at an HBCU. Her writing has appeared in both academic and popular spaces, including Gender and History, The Washington Post. Did you just say Middle East Eye? And she was formerly a fellow at the Library of Congress's Kluge Center. So welcome, Dr. Rahnama. Thanks so much for joining us. You'll be in conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Thompson, who is professor and Mohammed S. Farsi Chair of Islamic Peace at the School of International Studies at American University. Dr. Thompson is a historian of social movements and liberal constitutionalism in the Middle East with a focus on how race and gender relations have been conditioned by foreign intervention and international law. She has recently published her third book, How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, the Syrian Arab Congress, and the Destruction of its Historic Liberal Islamic Alliance. She's also author of two previous books, Justice Interrupted, The Struggle for Constitutional Government in the Middle East, and Colonial Citizens, Republican Rights, Paternal Privilege, and Gender in French Syria and Lebanon, which have won two national prizes. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Thompson.
Pleasure.
Just before I pass the microphone over to you two, I want to thank IMA staff, including Christian Clinton and Shayna Marshall, for their diligent work to make all of these things possible and handling the logistics and the publicity and so on. And our new work study student, Matthew. And also want to thank Atia Ahmed, who was organizing and directing the Institute in my absence. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to you, Sara.
I guess it's up to me to say welcome and thank you for inviting me to talk about a book that I was so excited to see come into print. It's been, oh my gosh, 22 years since I published Colonial Citizens. And at that time, I was searching in the dark for rereading of early 20th century history. And I'm still working on the post-World War I era, but there's been no book like yours, Sara, on a rereading of Algerian history in such an exciting and open-ended way. I think it might help our readers a little bit if you would read a passage, maybe from your introduction, just to sort of give a broad picture of what you're attempting to do, and then we'll dig into some of the juicy details.
Sure. It's hard, I'll say, to pick. First, let me just say hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to Mona and Atia and the whole gang, Christian and Shayna, everybody at GW who helped make this possible. It's really exciting to be here, and yeah, really fun to kind of kick off the book tour at close to DC, close to home. I'll say it's hard to pick a paragraph from your book. They're all so valuable to me. But I chose one from the introduction that I think offers a little bit of an overview of what the book is trying to do and how it speaks to a lot of the kind of stories in the broader historiography about colonial Algeria. So this is from page 10. And it says, while the commentators who raised questions about women in the Muslim press were largely male, this book is not another story of women's silences and absences. This study, unlike those on the women's rights projects that swept the Middle East in the interwar years, begins with working class women. In Algeria, women's changing status was not measurable through new access to consumption patterns, education, or activism, the key markers of new women or modern girls elsewhere. Instead, it looked like women struggling to support their families through continued poverty, with the occasional splurge on non-essential groceries like black market coffee. Still, women becoming primary earners within their households had a profound impact on power relations within the home. Outside of the home, these women also left their mark on the explosion of interwar public life. Women who worked by day as domestic workers also performed on stages in some of the country's largest theatrical venues. They campaigned for causes in the streets and marched among crowds in protests. They frequented cinemas and theaters. Their presence was felt within association meetings or political rallies by offering yoo-yoos of approval. The details of their lives and questions about these details animated debate all across the institutions of the emergent Muslim public: the press, association life, schools, urban space, and the theater. This book explores how women, both working class and elite, and concerned men, identified, pushed back against, and worked within the constraints placed on them, both by the French colonial state and by Muslim society. A mujahida, or female fighter in the Algerian War of Independence, Louisette Iguirariz, described her mother, who would have been of the interwar generation, as, quote, illiterate but hyper-politicized. The interwar discourses on women then, while perhaps not conventionally feminist, contained feminist possibilities which made possible the activism and militarism of the next generation.
Oh, that's excellent. That's an excellent paragraph to choose. Two things come out of that I want to sort of ask you to elaborate on. One is elsewhere in the introduction, you offer feminism and a definition of it that differs from current usage, right? I think you cite particularly Margot Badran's differentiation between secular feminism and Islamic feminism today. Can you expand on what you mean by, or what did feminism mean in terms of the lives and the activities these women engaged in?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll just start as a kind of baseline. I mean, I think when we hear the term today, typically we're envisioning a movement that's led by women, right? I mean, we think of like women in the streets or women's organizing, basically. And, you know, that has a very particular history in certain countries and things like that. But what I like about Margot Badran's definition, and I'll explain it, basically what she says is feminism is an awareness of the constraints placed upon women because of their gender and attempts to address those constraints or alleviate those constraints to evolve a more equitable gender system in a society. And I thought, like, well, wow, that's a really kind of open, fluid understanding of feminism. And that lets us bring a much larger range of discussions under the umbrella of what we consider feminist discussions. And the reason I think it's valuable to do that is I think particularly in Algeria, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about this more later on, but there's such a particular history to claims about Muslim misogyny. So talking about these movements in terms of feminism, in terms of women's rights, I think is really valuable as a kind of corrective to that overemphasis on misogyny.
Yeah, you know, I really appreciated that you grounded the story. I mean, much of the book is devoted to the ways in which social changes are talked about in the press. And I want to definitely ask you about your research on the press. But before going there, the fact that you ground it in the realities, the socioeconomic realities of post-World War I Algeria, where thousands of men out of work are streaming to the metropole, to Paris and other cities in France, leaving women at home to fend for their households. Perhaps there's some elder men in the family and so on, but that this wasn't a story only of burden and hardship for them, but you're telling a story about experiments with freedom, are you not? As they, particularly, there's a simultaneous migration if I understand correctly, into the cities from rural areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second chapter of the book immediately kind of sets up some of the social dynamics that you're describing, that there's this economic situation in the interwar years created by World War I and the Great Depression and its kind of global impacts, in which there's this real lack of male income. Many of the men who are still in Algeria are unemployed and employment is sparse. And so this creates these conditions where a lot of people migrate into cities, and women in particular take on new roles in the labor force, some working in factories, but mostly working as domestic workers. And so that kind of radically transforms not just earning capacity within households, but also the kind of optics of the city, for example, to the kind of visual spectacle of masses of women every morning leaving Muslim neighborhoods, going into European neighborhoods for work. So that really radically kind of changes what's possible. And I think it's really important to be attentive to those class dynamics, because that's one thing that really sets Algeria apart from other Middle Eastern spaces that also have these kind of women's movements happening at the same time. In Egypt, for example, and other spaces, these are elite women. These are, there's a certain kind of cultural milieu that's, propagating these ideas, educated women. In Algeria, there's really no, it's much smaller. The middle class is very small, very small elite. So you don't have those same that same kind of leadership coming from that class. Now, the part of your question about kind of, is this an emancipatory kind of movement for women? I'll say I kind of straddle the line of it and try to sit in the uncomfortable reality that on one hand, reading this in 2024, we would love a good story, right? We want to see like working girls, they're having fun, they're in the streets, they're wearing eyeliner, they're going to the cinema. And those things did happen to some extent. And we know because there's a kind of panic about it in the press. Like, oh, they say they're going to work, but why are they wearing makeup? And what are they doing after work? Nobody even knows. And, so there is some of that. And on the other hand, you're still dealing with a population that's very impoverished. Their material reality is very constrained. And so you also don't want to oversell the story that these girls are really living large by virtue of this employment. I mean, they're still really struggling on a day-to-day level. And yet there is a kind of big emergence into public life and big participation in public life that I think, really matters and really changes what's possible for that generation of women and subsequent generations.
Well, I think that word possible kind of captures a lot of the spirit of your writing, that they're testing boundaries, and that the future is not foreclosed, right? And that all writing about these women in the press is not negative or scolding of them. And that there is an embrace of change within. Here's the second line of questioning. And I don't know whether there's a particular women's story you'd like to encapsulate this in or not, but I also found it really valuable that you saw these discussions happening within an Islamic idiom. You're reacting against a historiography that pegs all change, modernity to French influence. Do you want to sort of elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, from the very beginning of this project, that was what really struck me about these discussions in the press, was the extent to which Islam was an important reference point for people, of every community, even people who themselves were secular people or who might have been completely assimilated to French culture and drinking alcohol. They're still writing and referencing the Prophet Muhammad, referencing the Quran, because they know that that's a kind of register and a language that carries a lot of weight to everybody in Algeria at that time, most people. So that was what was so interesting to me, that made these calls for women's advancement so immediately interesting to me, with the fact that it was very much intermeshed with new readings of Islamic history, readings of Islamic sources like the Quran, like the Hadith literature, like the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. All of these things were informing these commentators' ideas that women's advancement was not a French, import, but rather something that was integral to Islamic societies from their inception, that had kind of been lost over time because of, tribalism or, lack of education, a variety of factors. So that was really important to me from the beginning, to say that, you know, obviously their feminism, every part of their life is influenced by the colonial encounter. It's not in a vacuum, completely separate from the French. And yet they really make a point about, you know, grounding it in their own kind of what they see as shared Muslim culture.
Yeah. So is there a particular figure or personality that you particularly grew fond of, or that you think can capture some of these themes for our audience?
Yeah, so one person whose life to me really embodies some of what I'm talking about is Zuhur Wanisi. So there's a little bit of background context I have to give for her life story to make sense. One big development is that in the 1920s, the Muslim reform movement that kind of emerged in Egypt and in the Levant at that time makes its way to Algeria. And it's ushered into Algeria by Abdelhamid Ben Badis. He's educated at Zaytuna University in Tunis, and he comes back to Algeria and starts kind of preaching this Islamic reformist idea, which is, you know, that Muslims need to read the Quran, Muslims need to get away from the kind of Sufi practices of, you know, relying on saints and local shrines and that kind of thing, and they need to return to the Islam of the Prophet through, you know, rereading the Quran, things like that. And from the very beginning of his kind of Muslim reformist project in Algeria, he was adamant that, you know, the education of women was something that Algerians had kind of forgotten, and that was really integral to Islam and needed to be taken seriously. So he establishes in his own mosque, which is the Green Mosque in Constantine, he sets up these classes for women that he offers himself. And people say that he would actually like even turn the lights down low so that women could unveil if they wanted to. And this was scandalous at the time. People were like, what is this man doing alone in a room with all these women? Like, this is weird. But anyways, from the very beginning, he was adamant, no, women's education is serious and we need to take this serious. And these women are the mothers of the next generation. So they have to have a foundational knowledge in Islam and their rights in Islam and Islamic history and all of these things. And this is how you create a generation who can feel pride in their identity as Muslims and as Algerians, and who can kind of resist the negative, you know, stereotypes that are constantly being put upon the Algerians by the French, you know, that you're inferior, you're culturally inferior. So for him, education is a key piece of this. Now, throughout the 20s and 30s, Muslim reformists, the community that he created these schools for girls. The French colonial schools for girls at that time offered only basically artisanal training, carpet weaving, things like that, not really a multidisciplinary education like we would think of now. But the Muslim reformist schools, on the other hand, no, they offered, you know, reading and Arabic and history and, you know, science, a wide range of kind of subjects. So Zuhur Wanisi was among the first generation who was educated in these Muslim reformist schools. And she's born, I want to say in the early 30s. But when she goes to school, she goes to one of these Muslim reformist schools, and she ends up being trained to become a teacher in these schools as well. So she's initially a teacher, and in the 50s, she starts writing articles in the press as the War of Independence is kind of picking up. She writes these articles in the press directed towards Muslim women, and says, look, it is your Islamic responsibility to fight for your country and to fight for freedom, the freedom of your people. And look at these examples from early Islamic history of women companions of the Prophet Muhammad who participated in warfare. And that shows us that we shouldn't see this as not our struggle. We should understand that this is our responsibility to participate as well. So she writes these articles, and then in a post-independent Algeria, she takes on a variety of leadership roles in politics. So she's a minister of education. She's the first female parliamentarian. And what's so interesting to me about her life is that when Ben Badis first opened schools for girls in the interwar years, he was asked, you know, do you agree with the participation of women in politics? And he said, you know, I think women can play a big role in public life, as, you know, many, many roles. But no, I don't think that women should be, you know, should have these very high roles in politics.
Mhm.
But here was a woman who was educated in his schools and did it. And I think that that really embodies the kind of spirit of what I call the feminist possibility of the interwar years. That these women took what little education they had, whatever was kind of given to them, and used that to build and build and build and expand beyond what was initially envisioned as possible.
I'd love to drill down a little bit on that idea of what's possible and how people envision futures, because you specifically say as well in the book, though, that we need to resist the temptation to teleology, that somehow all of what you're studying in the 20s, 30s, 40s necessarily led to the female revolutionary fighter, right? That there were multiplicities of futures and possibilities imagined at the time. Maybe we should, maybe one way of sort of encapsulating that for our audience is to think about the kinds of conversations and journals and newspapers that you studied. What I found particularly compelling is the way in which you see a network or a kind of conversation amongst these different journals going on. Can you maybe give us a little bit of flavor about how we need to see the embedded in the experience of these people before the 1950s, multiple visions of the future that were not necessarily going to be foreclosed by the violence at Sétif and the undermining of, civilian politics in favor of militant politics.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that is so interesting to me about the interwar years is precisely what you're describing, which is that there isn't a single dominant set of politics yet. People are looking outwards towards many possibilities. And to go back to your question about the press and, the kind of multiple communities at play. So there is, the Muslim reformists who I just mentioned, who they have multiple journals. Some are in French, some are in Arabic, some are kind of more directed towards the youth, some are more directed towards kind of religious audiences. There are, other Muslim groups, like Sufi groups, like a particular Sufi community that has their own journal that's very quite conservative about women's advancement. Then you have the journals affiliated with the Algerians who were trained to be school teachers in French colonial schools. So these are often people who in their own personal lives have kind of assimilated more to French culture and see the value in that assimilation for Algerian culture writ large. And so, each of these different communities has a different kind of future that they're envisioning. And often within these communities, even there's multiple futures. So among Muslim reformists, for example, they eventually became very connected to the movement for an independent nationalist Algeria. But at the beginning, not necessarily. And there were plenty of people who felt, look, that's not going to happen. We can still find our own kind of emancipation within a French colonial Algeria. And that's through our own education, through our own emphasis on our language, our own kind of strategies, basically. And so what was I going to say about that? Yeah, so basically there's a multiplicity of ideas about possible futures, and there isn't one dominant one. That kind of shifts by the time you get to the 40s, later periods. But in that earlier period, yeah, that's one of the things that's so interesting. I'm trying to think there were so many different parts of your question. I'm trying to think.
Right. No, sorry. But I guess maybe we can sort of come at it in another direction too, and thinking about the research you did. Where did you find these periodicals? How are you able to make connections? And you show at times that articles in one are responding to articles in another, and so on. But most importantly, to recover voices of ordinary people, both in Arabic and those who knew French, like the school teachers, right? That have been ignored until now. Where did this lead you, and what treasures did you find? Just for the information of potential researchers who might want to pick up where you left off.
Sure, yeah. So it was a long process.
Imagine.
As you know, working on women, I mean, there's just constantly, you're constantly being told, um, you know, there aren't the sources. The sources aren't there. You're never going to be able to do this project from the beginning, you know, at every step of the way. The sources aren't there. The sources aren't there. And so I was lucky that there was so much about women within the press, because that on its own constituted just such a wealth of information. And so yeah, the press obviously is a big one, and I would say that there's been less attention put on the Arabic language press, which I think illuminates different kinds of connections. Um,
And
and
is that kept in? Did you have to go to Algeria? Are they also in French
So
libraries?
they are, yeah, they are in French libraries. I did go to Algeria, and I'll say too, I mean, as a graduate student, I was very cynical of all of the scholars who work on Algeria who never go to Algeria, because there's quite a lot of them. And for
And never read
people,
Arabic, thank you.
yeah, and don't read Arabic, yeah. And for scholars of the Middle East, they're like, this doesn't make any sense. What are you talking about? Like, with no way we could have done this research without learning um, Arabic. But it's actually, you know, more common than you think, particularly because Algeria gets envisioned as part of this French colonial world and disconnected from the Middle East.
Right.
So that's, you know, but anyways, I was quite cynical of and critical of those scholars before I went. And after going, realized like, wow, it's really hard, actually. It is really, really hard to get, first of all, just the visa. And since I've gone, it's gotten even harder to get the visa. They're more, it's more difficult to get the visas, particularly when you're asking for a research visa.
Ooh,
Many scholars I know in recent years have been denied. And then once you get there, the process of getting the access to the archives can be very challenging. It's a long authorization process, to the extent that at one point I went to Tunisia to work on, to you know, look for connections there. And the first day there, they're like, here's, you know, okay, yeah, you're in the archives. What do you need? Here's our computer where you can search everything. And I was like, what? What is this
And
utopia? I don't.
Tunisia is another world. I mean,
And
that
I'm texting
library, the
all my
National
friends.
Library is fabulous as
Yeah,
well. Yeah,
exactly. I'm texting all my friends, like, why do we work on Algeria? What were we
yeah.
thinking?
Were there many periodicals from Algeria in the libraries over there?
In Tunisia, there were a few, and really,
Um,
what was interesting was observing French surveillance of Algerians who would travel to Tunisia, sometimes to raise money from Tunisian
yeah,
intellectuals for, you know, different community things that were happening in Algeria. So that was the real source base that was illuminated there.
right.
But to go back to your question, so other than the press, you know, sources came in really unexpected places. So while I was in Algeria, I met another friend, and he said, well, do you know about the archive of the Archdiocese of Algiers? And I said, no, where is that? And it happened to be in this basement of an old church. And it was kind of really one of those things you would, you know, there's no website. It's only if you're in the know.
Right.
Um,
What was there?
so,
What did you
sorry.
find? What
Oh,
in
so
that
there
archive?
was, you know what, one of the really interesting things I found there was some master's theses that were written by European settler women at the time, but who were interested in Algerian women. So they came and they wrote about like, for example, there was one about women's work in the Casbah, and like what were the different kinds of work that Algerian women were engaged in, and they interviewed different families,
Wow.
and they were charting how women working radically transformed family life. And, you know, women reported like, well, now I'm the one who, you know, manages the money, and I'm the one who, you know, and it's sources like that that helps you realize like, oh, wow, this is like a really radical transformation to family life, you know, that happens alongside these women earning an income. So yeah, a couple different master's theses that were very interesting. I'm trying to think, some church documents that were interesting that showed me how church officials were thinking about some of these questions, like the Muslim family and the problems facing Muslim families, and how there were kind of intersections between concerns that Muslims were having about, you know, alcohol and prostitution, things like that, social concerns, and these church officials. So, you know, just really random things. Other things I found in Algerian archives, like the local wilaya archives, were like association records of women's associations.
Interesting. From
So
like the 30s?
Yeah. Yeah. And so these were often organizations that were described as spaces of collaboration for French and Muslim women, and often it was mostly French women, but still there were Muslim women participating. And again, it's another avenue to see some of these dynamics play out.
Right, right. Where's the best place to study Algeria in France? Say you can't get your visa to Algeria. Where
So definitely
where was the mother lode for you?
the BANF for sure. I would say probably I found more at the French National Library than I did at the archives in Aix. But of course, the archives in Aix were a wealth of information. And hilariously, sometimes I would find something in Algeria and I'd be so excited, and then I'd be in France a couple months later and see the same document there.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I've had that happen too.
Yeah.
Okay, look, why don't, I think we've got about 10 minutes left before we have to open things up to the Q&A. I don't want to dominate completely, although I have so many more things I'd like to talk about, but why don't we, I guess I'm kind of interested, and I think you were interested, I got the sense in the book anyway, that your research really can speak to the current moment. There are things you want to say, or historical perspectives to offer today. And I'm wondering if you might like to talk about that.
Sure, absolutely. So, one piece that's really critical to understanding why these feminist discussions in Algeria were so important is this idea that, previously when we talked about Orientalism as scholars, we envisioned that this was kind of almost like in the realm of arts. We thought about European fantasies about Muslims and how you might see this in a painting or in a travel account or things like that. But what I feel like the field of Algerian history really changed in the last 5-10 years. And part of that was Judith Circus's book, Sex and Sovereignty, in French Algeria. And what she shows is the extent to which these European Orientalist fantasies about Muslims were really critical to how the French state legitimized the legal exclusion of Algerians from, citizenship rights, the confiscation of Algerian land, the, dismantling of religious institutions. All of these things are legitimized through these claims that Muslims are so misogynistic and are so backwards when it comes to sexuality and family life that they can't be modern subjects. And I think my book really speaks to that, both in terms of, the moment, the kind of the moment that, the book is speaking to in the interwar years, how those commentators understood that about the French. And so when they're writing back and they're saying, actually, feminism is an integral part of our faith, they're writing back against those really foundational ideas of the whole French colonial project in Algeria. But also, how those ideas of the French are really enduring, unfortunately. So, whether it's, all sorts of different things. So I have an article that just came out last week in Middle East Eye talking about these claims. I know, Libby, you're not going to want to talk about Israel, Palestine, but talking about these claims of, Hamas and mass rape. And one thing that was interesting to me was before any evidence was available, this idea that this happened was so readily accepted, and that idea was so readily metabolized into an acceptance of really large-scale violence. And to me, that indicates that we're not talking about something that just came to be in this moment. We're talking about an old, long idea, which is that Muslim men are particularly prone to barbaric violence, to animalistic violence, to, all these things. And that the idea that claim is still politically useful in 2024, to me, that really indicates why it's so important to bring forth these examples of kind of, Muslim feminism, of Muslims who are, interrogating these ideas and working through them in their own way. Again, they're not perfect feminist heroes, but they're taking very seriously these ideas about women's advancement and really interrogating their faith, interrogating people around them, trying to kind of, advance again a more equitable system for women. And I think that's just left out of our understanding of Muslim cultures in the US. And so I think
No.
it's a necessary corrective, unfortunately.
Oh, and I think, I will hope that there would be even more sort of historical archaeology of how, of the deployment of the, what you have to call our rhetorical political strategies, right? I think my suspicion is that there was a very close relationship between the sort of opening up, the changes going on in Muslim Algerian society, and the reification of Orientalism, racist stereotype in that period. I've been working on the immediate post-war period in the Arab East, but I published last year an article in France about the endeavor of rereading the 1920s as a kind of backlash against what was a brief opening in the latter part of World War I. I don't know whether you came across anything on this, but Clemenceau, the last prime minister of the war, actually endeavored to reward Algerian Muslim men, not women, but men, for their military service, opening up representation on local councils and so on. He was an age-old enemy of the colonial lobby. They were livid, right, at the John Art Law. You see the same sort of initiative by Clemenceau in French West Africa amongst the Senegalese, trying to reward those soldiers, right? And in the same period, I see, that there was a minority, less powerful tendency in France to see and wish to reward Muslims who fought in the Eastern Arab world on behalf of the Allies, right? We know Clemenceau is ousted after a right-wing parliament is elected in late 1919. And as Alice Conklin showed some years ago in her work, and others have, there was a sort of a kind of building of a new power to the repressive Orientalist and racist ideologies, emphasizing difference over the possibility of, in the old language, of assimilation, versus association. But, oh no, these Muslims could not ever become citizens like us, right? There's a scholar, he's been at Yale Law School, Patrick Vey, who has written a lot on immigration and citizenship in France, has sort of looked into some of these similar things. I don't know whether you get a sense of the relationship between the sort of reification of French Orientalist rhetoric, precisely because there was this opening and this period of change amongst the Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, I think the dynamic there that's really familiar is the colonial lobby and just how strong they remain in stifling any possibility for change. So I was talking about education, for example, and how education in Algeria was very technical for the education that was open to Algerians. And that was the colonial lobby. I mean, in the metropole, people were saying, why shouldn't they get the same education as European settlers? And it was the colonial lobby that said, absolutely not. So I think those dynamics within a particular society and how that affects, the treatment of the colonial subjects is a very familiar story, unfortunately.
I just think for today, it's important to show that this wasn't predetermined. This isn't essential, that there was an internal dissent, against colonialism within France, so that, because it's easy to replay the backlash instead of saying, hey, wait a second, this is just a contingent thing, that Algeria didn't have to turn out the way it did. And, the violence did not have to occur the way it did. Choices were made. I mean, you think of the Bloom-Violet law, right? And there were consistent efforts at opening. I don't know, in terms of your own work and opening up, instead of looking simply at silencing and oppressing of women, to really play with that boundary line and that gray zone seems to me to be a very fruitful endeavor for us as historians right now.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what so much of the book is concerned with, I think, is trying to open up those kind of gray areas and show that, there are very few neat categorizations that we can use in this period, because there's just so much fluidity, and that's worth, seeing for what it was.
Yeah, I was last question, because I'm looking at the clock. You mentioned briefly that some women do go into theater and things. I've been long interested in, and I use in my classes and lectures, the example of Kulthum starting her career in the 1920s and finding, she abandons love songs for more classical songs and this and that. Then she goes back to the love songs because they're popular, and she leaves behind the explicitly religious songs. Yes, there are some hostile crowds, but it seemed to be sort of the same process that you're describing. It gives the lie to the idea that the 1920s and 30s must be read as the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood and a strict kind of Islamism. Would you say the same thing about Algeria at that time?
I would say that if you're accepting the kind of teleological view in which everything is headed towards the Algerian War of Independence, then yes, the Muslim reform movement really comes front and center, because they're understood as the kind of proto-nationalists that lead the way there. But I think when you can put aside that teleology and say, look, there's this intellectual fluidity, and we want to look at that, we want to take that seriously, we want to embrace all of those contradictions, then you can see exactly what you're talking about, that it wasn't linear. And even within these Muslim reformist communities that maybe our outside perspective would assume were so conservative, no, they were calling for women's advancement. You have women like Zuhur Wanisi in these communities pushing back and saying, why shouldn't I be a politician? Why shouldn't I do these things? The generation after this first in her generation as well, girls educated in these Muslim reformist schools, like in the 50s, there's a photograph of the girls in the schools, and they're all unveiled. And they were like, we can unveil if we want to. We don't have to. And this isn't a Muslim reformist school, So I think it's like important for us to understand these things don't always operate according to our assumptions about how they do. And there certainly aren't any, clear lines. Yeah.
To bring politics, the politics in the sense of the daily negotiation back into the story, I think is one of the wonderful things you do in this amazing book. And I love the cover, everyone. I'll turn it back over. I think, Mona, will you handle the Q&A? All right. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Libby. It means so much to have you here.
Thanks. So we do have a couple of questions, and feel free to add your questions to the chat. So one is just asking you a simple question about how many years you devoted to the project, and maybe you can talk about, maybe this is a graduate student and they're curious about kind of the research process and turning, a dissertation into a book and so on.
So this started as a dissertation, absolutely. In a way, it started from the very beginning of my process at graduate school, just because at Hopkins, they do something wonderful called a first year paper, where from the very first year, they make you start engaging in primary source research to try and, kick off the process of a dissertation. But I would say, and that was like literally the first semester was when I stumbled upon some of these articles about Muslim feminism. And I was like, whoa, what's going on? I need to understand this more. But so that was, probably about 10 years ago now that it really first started. But I would say it was in my third or fourth year of the project that I really started conducting the research. So I would say it was probably, the dissertation process was probably, 3 or 4 years of, researching and getting it to that place. And then after that, the process of turning it into a book, I would say probably was about 2 years of revising it, yeah, and kind of rewriting it, to take it really, to make it more legible, to kind of, take out a lot of that dissertation quality where you're kind of overstating to prove your point, and lots and lots and lots of sources, and kind of simplifying and streamlining it to be a more legible book. I would say that probably took about 2 years. And then, of course, the process of production of a book is like at least another year, page proofs and waiting and all of that. So almost a decade. It's funny to hold this thing in my hand and say, like, you took 10 years of my life. But in that way, it feels super, intimate, like a super close relationship with this book, which I'm really grateful for too.
Yes, that sounds about right. I think we
Yeah.
all have experienced that. We have another question by Hassan Hamami. He says, with a large number of men who were killed during the Algerian War of Liberation, would you talk about the expanded role of surviving women in both raising a family and earning a living during the revolutionary period, and the newly growing generation of young children raised in a fatherless family, but with a single female parent working and raising them? And I'll just add, there was sort of a corollary question about women's pay and whether working women received equal wages. So maybe you can add that on to your answer.
Sure. So it's a hard question to answer because the generation after the War of Independence, we're talking about the 60s and 70s. My book goes until the 40s. So it's quite a different time. The one thing I'll say that maybe a little bit answers this question is that I think the dynamics of women's participation in the war and the war itself very much shaped Algeria in its post-independence period, to the extent that there was this feeling that a kind of national debt was owed to women for their participation in the war. And so Algeria had one of the most pro-women family codes, for example, in the region, and people in the 60s, and people attribute that to women's participation in the war. In terms of the dynamics of the Algerian family, I'm not sure I really have the information to answer that question, unfortunately. The question about equal pay. So in my period, no. Part of the reason, so in my period, what's interesting is women joined the workforce as domestic workers. And previously that work was predominantly done by Muslim men, but because Algerian women would accept a lower pay than men, they were the preferential worker, basically. So there's a real kind of overtaking. So like in the 1910s, the work of domestic work is largely dominated by Muslim men. And then by the 50s, it's Muslim women who overwhelmingly do that work. And part of that is a question of wages.
I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about your new research or your next project, because you sort of talked a little bit about how you are starting to work on that. If you could share.
Sure. Oh, sorry, I got another question in the chat. I'll answer that after. So the new project is a history of the Middle East in the 60s and 70s, from the perspective of teenage girls. And so it looks at, I want to look at a few different cities. Like I'm envisioning right now that it would be Baghdad, Kabul, Tehran. And looking at, how women's perspectives and oral histories can change our understanding of this historic moment. And, it's particularly in cities, kind of urban change, social change. What does it look like when we center young girls? The category of youth in the Middle East and Middle Eastern literature is like really emerging in a big way right now in the scholarship. And so it feels like a fun moment to dive into this project. And I was telling Libby about it, and I was saying, so far the work has been a lot of oral histories, which is a great work it's a great kind of research process for somebody with children, because getting to the archives is not, and spending like a ton of time in the archives like I did for this book, is not as easy when you have small children. So you know, sitting with some older ladies and talking, you know, doing these oral histories, that's more my speed these days. And I'm envisioning, you know, envisioning it a little bit like Laila Abou-Lughad's writing Women's Worlds. I mean, that was such a formative book for me when I was in, you know, first became interested in gender history in the Middle East. So the idea of like, how do you tell women's stories and like really honor them and almost take a step back as the kind of observer and as the scholar, and let their stories kind of speak for themselves. I'm very inspired by that. So this message in the chat was a direct message to me, so maybe I should just read it and respond. Okay. Um, you know what? Actually, this is something I'll follow up on email. This is somebody asking about a particular project that they're starting. So I'll do it. Thank you for that question, and I'll shoot you an email about that.
Well, I have a follow-up question to your comment about honoring women's stories and their views of the world. Where do you stand? Perhaps many in the audience are familiar with Assia Jabbar.
Mhm.
And, you know, there have been controversy about her work, partly because she writes in French. She lives in France and so on. But how would you see your book in relation to the work of literary scholars like her as well?
Well, I think her work is wonderful. I mean, it's able to offer so much texture to a lot of the problems that women describe. So the last chapter of my book looks at the 1940s, and I kind of push ahead to that moment because there is the early versions of women's pages where you get women's voices in this big way, you know, kind of entering the scene, and they're talking about you know, all of the issues they're facing. And so the book kind of shifts from being a lot of men and other people talking about women to women suddenly being center stage and saying, you know, having the chance to kind of write back against some of these discourses. And one thing they're really adamant about is being, they're really good at critiquing simultaneously French colonial society and Muslim men in their own society. They say, you know, they kind of call out all of these contradictions, and they say, you know, Muslim men love to talk about women's education, but actually when we're just trying to walk to school, we face so much street harassment. Or Muslim men talk about the important role of the mother within the family, but in actuality, they're treated like the slave of the household and they don't have any respect from their husbands. Or, you know, Muslim men talk about us as mothers of the next generation, but then they go and they marry European women, you know? So there's all of these kinds of contradictions that Muslim women are, you know, highlighting, underscoring. And I think Assia Jabbar's work is in that same vein and offering much, much more texture to it, adding her own, you know, personal experiences, adding you know, what the literary can accomplish, which are, you know, really illustrating those tensions of, you know, yeah, what one faces at the hands of your own, you know, society, basically.
Right. I think what's refreshing and what keeps me returning to women's histories of the region as well is that women historians have carved a space outside of the compulsion, particularly, I mean, I'm hit with it because I work on the Eastern Mediterranean. There's this compulsion to center your history book on the downloading of a government archive, right? And, you know, and if you do something else, somehow that's not real history, right? And pushing us toward thinking about problem-driven historiography, you know, where we're not driven by the archive or the documents, and to conceptualize a bit more and to look, you know, once you have an novel question, to look for any and all kinds of evidence that you can gather wherever it might be. Do you feel yourself sort of part of, I mean, I don't know if you feel the same tension or not in your work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of the problem that I diagnose among, French colonial historians is that we're so wedded to these state archives, and that really limits the kinds of stories we can tell. And again, I'm like, no wonder women have been completely ignored in the historiography thus far when you're insistent on, there's this like fetishization of the state archive, and which is again French language sources only, like it's already limiting you in what you're able to kind of pay attention to. And so absolutely, I mean, I think it's, this project would not have been possible if I had strictly been invested in the state archive. And I think in Algeria, because there is such an interesting story about state power, how state power operated in the colonial period, and of course anti-colonial nationalism and this emergence of a new state, an independent state. All of that story is so fascinating. So understandably, there's been a ton of ink spilled on that on those topics, but again, it leaves out a lot of these other discussions that my book tries to kind of illuminate. There was another question that came to me directly in the chat. Somebody says, I wonder if you can speak more to the resonances, intersections, and particularities between Algerian Muslim feminist movements and those in other parts of Swana, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Egypt, etc. So that was another thing that was really interesting to me. Again, that this is actually a great question to come after the archival question, because in part, this obsession with the state archives is what has kept Algerian historians locked in this frame of France, Algeria, to the detriment of seeing other kinds of connections. And one of those connections is to the broader Middle East. I mean, when you start reading, particularly in the Arabic language sources, newspapers, you're struck by how much intellectual energy they're expelling on thinking about what's happening in Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan. They're really, really interested in these kind of state-led feminist projects that are happening there. And that's what's so interesting to me too, is that you have this society, in the case of Turkey, when we think of Ataturk, obviously we think of, his women's rights and those things. Sure, we do. But we also think of him so much in terms of his secularism and the way he kind of remade Turkey, moving it away from the Ottoman Empire, abolishing the caliphate of the Ottoman Empire, all of that secularization of kind of Turkish, infrastructure, all of that. For us, that secularism is so important. But for the Algerians, particularly in the 20s, they really read him in terms of the way he stands up to European society. And so for them, he is the hero. They even call him the hero of Islam. And you're like, what? So that's been interesting to me, is not just seeing their appreciation for women's rights, initiatives that were happening elsewhere in the region, but also they're reading these figures in their own, frameworks, not in the kind of necessarily dominant framework that these figures are read and understood. So that's really interesting to me too. And, to further answer this question, I mean, I think there's a lot of similarities in the way that in these other Middle Eastern spaces, there's also an emphasis on women's education. There's also an emphasis on using Islam to kind of legitimize these calls for women's advancement. But the book obviously also, kind of suggests that Algeria is really different and unique because of that settler colonial context.
I think unless do you have any other direct chat questions? Because I can't, I don't want to cut off the potential for any other discussion.
That's what I'm seeing, I
think we'll close there. I want to thank both Dr. Thompson and Dr. Rahnama for this really interesting conversation, and to try and allure you to come back for two future events. The Middle East Policy Forum will organize an event on soldiers of democracy, military legacies in the Arab Spring, a discussion with author Sharon Graywall from William and Mary and Ambassador Gordon Gray. That's February 13th at 5:30. And we also have another IMIS conversation on politics in the crevices, urban design and the making of property markets in Cairo and Istanbul, between a discussion between myself and author Sara El-Kazaz. And that's on the 15th at February 15th at 12:30. So, thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. And Sara, good luck with that next project.
Thank you.
And Libby, hope to see you around.
Yes,
Thanks
definitely.
so much for this great
Thank you
meeting
for
of
hosting us.
Yes, thank
Bushfire.
you for hosting us. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Take care.
Have a good evening.